Is the band going?
Is who?
Is the band?
Good morning, and thank you for that beautiful song. This is entitled, I Did It My Way.
Frank Sinatra.
I will strengthen the house of Judah, and I will save the house of Joseph. I will bring them back because I have compassion on them, and they shall be as though I had not rejected them, for I am the Lord their God, and I will answer them. My father loved the crooners, Andy Williams, Tony Bennett, and of course Frank Sinatra. One song still echoes in my ears, I did it my way. That was me for the first 23 years of my life. It didn't go so well. Excuse me. Trials, challenges, and loneliness were the fruit of my life, and I felt so empty. Have you ever tried to do something your way, only to have it implode? Abraham did. He was promised a son through his barren wife, Sarah. Growing impatient, he did it his way, and Ishmael was born. From that one act of self-help, a world of problems emerged that still plague us today. Eventually, God provided the fulfillment to his promise by giving Isaac. I have learned to trust God, but I still wrestle with being patient for his plan and purposes to be fulfilled in his time and manner. Jesus tells us plainly, I am the way. He is God's chosen means of salvation. His way leads to true life, joy, and peace. Let us pray. O Lord, help me stop doing things my way and live life your way this day. Amen. Amen.
Just remind everybody about the Christmas party, because this is next Thursday.
What?
The Christmas party, because it is already.
Oh, the Christmas party.
So I need reservations.
Okay, you get your checks to Joan if you have not already. The Christmas party is Thursday at San Jose at 6 o'clock.
6:30.
6:30, okay. Everybody will be there. It's a wonderful party. Okay, it is December. My MO in December is to tell Christmas stories. I kind of go to the vault 1st of December. I've got a triple dresser down in the guest room now that has got 9 drawers in it. It's full of Christmas stories. Books and stories. And so it's a making a choice when I get to it. But I didn't have a hard time this year. I picked one out very quickly just because it's one of my favorites. It has a powerful lesson in it, a powerful story in it that I think is the Christmas story. And it's called The Best Christmas Pageant Ever. And a lot of you've heard it, but you've heard the Christmas Carol and you've heard Christmas stories over and over again. They bear telling year after year. This was written by Barbara Robinson. The last time that I used this story in a group setting was 2005. It's been a while. The Herdsmans were absolutely the worst kids in the history of the world. They lied, they stole, they smoked cigars, they talked dirty, they hit little kids, and they cussed their teachers, and they took the Lord's name in vain. And most of all, they burned down Fred Shoemaker's old broken down tool house right to the ground. It was a terrific fire. 2 fire engines, 2 police cars, 5 dozen donuts sent up from the Tasty Lunch Diner. They were supposed to be for the firemen, but by the time the fire got out, the donuts were all gone. The Herdmans got them, and what they couldn't eat, they stuffed into their pockets. I couldn't understand why they hung around the scene of the crime. Everybody knew they did it. Even one fireman collared Claude Herdman and said, "You kids started this fire, didn't you, smoking cigars?" But Claude just said, "We weren't smoking no cigars." And that was the truth. They weren't. They were playing with a chemistry set which Leroy Herdman had stolen from the hardware store. They mixed up all the powder in that chemistry set. They set it on fire, and it burned up. And Leroy was so mad. It burned up before he had any chance to make a bomb. So the fire chief gave them all a lecture and said, "It's dangerous to play around with matches and gasoline and stuff like that. Let this be a lesson to you." Ha! The lesson the herdsman learned was that where there's a fire, there will be donuts if you stick around long enough. These kids were so all around awful, you could hardly believe they were real. Ralph, Imogene, Leroy, Claude, Ollie, and Gladys. 6 stringy-haired kids, all alike except being different sizes. They lived over a garage at the top of Spruill Hill. Nobody used the garage anymore, but that didn't keep the herdsmen from banging the door up and down just as fast as they could, trying to squash one another. That was their idea of a game. Where most people had grass in their front yard, the herdmans had rocks. Where other people had hydrangeas, the herdmans had poison ivy. They also had a sign in their yard that said, "Beware of the cat." Now, kids always laughed at that sign until they got a look at the cat. It really wasn't a regular cat at all. I mean, once Claude Herdman brought that cat to first grade for show and tell. He hadn't fed it for a couple of days, and when he opened the box, that cat shot straight up into the air and came down clawing on the blackboard. The teacher, Miss Brandel, yelled for everybody to get out in the hall, and she kept yelling for Claude to come get his cat. But Claude went out in the hall with everybody else, and the cat settled down once he got something to eat. It was the goldfish out of the aquarium, and Ramona Billings' 2 pet mice. Ramona cried and carried on so bad they had to send her home. The room was a wreck. Miss Brandel was a wreck, and the first graders were all hysterical, and Claude was sent home with his cat. After that, nobody could bring anything alive to show and tell. The Herdmans moved from grade to grade through the Woodrow Wilson School, but they never got held back in a grade. At the end of a grade, Claude didn't know his ABCs, or his numbers, or his colors, but Miss Brandel passed him right on anyway. For one thing, she would have Ollie Herdman coming along. That was one thing about the Herdmans. There was always another one, and no teacher was crazy enough to have 2 of them in the same year. I was in the same grade with Imogene Herdman, and what I did was stay out of her way. It wasn't easy. You couldn't do it if you were pretty or ugly or smart or dumb or had red hair or there was any unusual thing about you. But if you were just a plain medium kid like me, kept your mouth shut, and when the teacher said who can name the 50 states, even if you knew them all, you had to be quiet. And then you might have a chance to stay clear of Imogene. Twice a year, we all had to go to the health clinic to get weighed. Miss Hemphill said, what you weighed was nobody's business but your own. But Imogene Herdman managed to hide behind the curtain and just stay there and watch the scales. And when Miss Hemphill finally saw her, she said, "Why are you here, Imogene?" And she said, "Well, I think you need to go down and see if I have what Ollie has." What does Ollie have?" she asked. Imogene shrugged. "I don't know, but it's got red spots and he itches all over." And so Miss Hipnell had to hurry down to the first grade to take a look at Ollie, and Imogene stayed behind and copied everybody's weight and used it to blackmail them all the rest of the year. Wanda Pierce was a chubby girl. Her hobby was charm bracelets. She had 22 charms on it, and every one of them did something. Wheels turned, piano keys went clink, drawers opened and closed. Wanda was also a very rich girl, so every time you turned around, she had a new charm on her bracelet. "Look at my new charm," she would say. "It costs $6.95 without tax. It's a bird. You push this knob and its wings flutter. It costs $6.95 without tax." They were great charms, but everybody got sick of hearing about them, and it was almost a relief when Imogene blackmailed her out of her bracelet. "I know how much you weigh," Imogene said, "and I'm going to tell everybody." And to prove it, she showed Wanda a piece of paper with her weight on it. It must have been a big number because she got the charm bracelet right away. And then she got Lucille Golden's alligator pocketbook and 10 cents a week from Floyd Brush until he caught pneumonia and lost 15 pounds and he wouldn't pay her anymore. My friend Alice Wendelkin was just so clean, she had detergent hands by the time she was 4 years old. But one day at recess, Imogene smacked her on the head and hollered, "Cooties!" And the teacher took them both to the principal's office. "I had to hit her," Imogene said. "She has cooties coming right out of her hair." Well, the principal didn't want a school full of head lice, so he sent Alice to the nurse, who went through her hair with a magnifying glass and pronounced that she was really okay. But it was too late, and everybody called Alice Cooties all the rest of the year. It was no good trying to get secrets on the Herdsmans. Everybody knew they did awful things, but you couldn't get them in trouble with their daddy because he climbed on a freight train when Gladys was 2 years old and nobody had seen him since. Mrs. Herdsman worked double shifts at the shoe factory, and you could never find her at home. So those kids did just what they wanted to. Ralph looked after Imogene, and Imogene looked after Leroy, and Leroy looked after Claude, and so on down the line. The big ones taught the little ones everything they knew. And the proof of that was that the meanest herdman of all was Gladys, who was the youngest. We figured out they were all headed straight for hell by way of the penitentiary until they got themselves mixed up with the church and my mother and the Christmas pageant. Mother made us be in the Christmas pageant, me and my brother Charlie, every year. We didn't want to. She made us go see it. She made my father go see it, and he didn't want to. I've seen the Christmas pageant. You haven't seen it this year. Charlie is a shepherd. Charlie was a shepherd last year. I'm putting on my bathrobe and staying home by the fire. It's always the same. No, it's different this year. What's different about it? Charlie is wearing your bathrobe. So my father had to go see his bathrobe. Actually, he went every year, but it was a struggle. My mother said it was her contribution to the pageant to get my father to go. But one year, she got stuck with the whole thing. Mrs. George Armstrong was always the director of the pageant. She lived about a half block from us, and one afternoon she fell down and broke her leg. We saw the ambulance pick her up. "Call Mr. Armstrong," she yelled. "Shut off the stove under my potatoes. Inform the ladies' aid that I won't be at the meeting. Get Mrs. McCarthy to handle the bazaar. Don't let my kids trample the hedge. Don't forget about the potluck supper." Even in her great pain, Mrs. Armstrong could still give orders, and she was naturally head of everything she belonged to. She did everything but preach at church, but most of all, she ran the Christmas pageant. And here it was, the day after Thanksgiving, and she was flat on her back. So my mother got stuck with it. I could run a potluck supper, she said, with one hand tied behind my back. All you got to do is make sure that everybody doesn't bring meatloaf. But the Christmas pageant is complicated. Now, our pageant was not what you would call a 4-star entertainment. The script was pretty standard. The inn, the stable, the shepherds, the star, the casting. Primary kids are angels. Intermediate kids are shepherds. Big boys are wise men. Elmer Hopkins, the minister's son, is Joseph. And as long as I can remember, Alice Wendleton has been Mary, because she is neat and clean and smart and holy looking. All the rest of us are angels. We sing in the choir, and we stand lined up by height because we can't sing parts. Aside from that, it's just the Christmas story, year after year, with people shuffling around in bathrobes and sheets and coat hanger wings. Well, my father said to my mother, "Now's your big chance. You can do something grand." "Oh, I guess you think you're pretty funny," she said. "The Christmas pageant is tradition, and I do not plan to do anything different." Now, that was before my brother Charlie's Sunday school teacher thought up something different. Once a month, the whole kids' Sunday school would go into the church service and sing, "Jesus Loves Me," until this teacher said something different. We should write down on a piece of paper what we like best about Sunday school. And then in church, we had to stand up in front of the congregation and say what we had on our paper. Betsy Cathcart stood up and said, "What I like about Sunday school is the good feeling that I get when I go there." And another kid said he liked hearing Bible stories. And another one said she liked singing songs about Jesus. And finally the teacher said, "I think we have time for one more." My little brother Charlie. "Charlie, tell us what you like about Sunday school." And my little brother stood up, and he didn't even look at his paper. "What I like best about this Sunday school," he said, "is there aren't any herdsmen here." The teacher should have stuck with "Jesus Loves Me." Dad said that wasn't a very Christian sentiment, but Charlie had spent his whole second grade being struck black and blue because he had to sit next to Leroy Herdsman. However, it was Charlie's fault that the Herdsman showed up at church. 3 days in a row that week, Leroy had stolen the dessert from Charlie's lunchbox. Charlie finally gave up and tried to fight back. "That's all right," he said. "You just take it. I get all the dessert I want at Sunday school. They serve me chocolate cake, Kool-Aid, refreshments all the time." "You're a liar," Leroy said. "Am not," Charlie went on. "We get jelly beans and cookies and popcorn balls." "From who?" Leroy demanded. "From our minister," Charlie said. The next Sunday, they were all there. All 6 of them. Eyes peeled for the refreshments. "Where's the cake?" Ralph asked the usher. "I don't know about the cake, but all the canned goods for the orphan's home were in the kitchen." Bingo. Ralph thought he was onto something when he saw all the cans of spaghetti and peanut butter and grape juice and everything. So they decided to stay for church. They didn't sing hymns or say prayers, but Imogene took a handful of coins right out of the collection plate when it went past her. And then at the close of Sunday school, Mr. Grady came around and made an announcement. "We'll be starting rehearsals for the Christmas pageant on Sunday." He went on. "We want every boy and girl to take part in the pageant, so be prepared to stay late for rehearsal." Alice Wendleton turned to me and said, "Oh, I hope you're going to be in the angel choir again this year. You're so good in the angel choir." When what she meant was, "I hope you don't think you're going to be married this year because your mother is running the pageant." But she didn't have to worry. I didn't want to be Mary. I didn't want to be in the angel choir either, but I had to do something. All of a sudden, Emma Jean Herdman dug me in the rib with her elbows. "What's a Christmas pageant?" It's a play." "What's a play?" said Emma Jean. "It's kind of like a movie." Emma Jean looked interested. All the herdsmen loved to go to the movies, although they never paid. One or two of them would start a fight at the box office while the other ones slipped in. They got their popcorn the same way. They spread out then all over the theater, and the manager could never find them. "Well, what's this movie about?" Emma Jean asked. "It's about Jesus," I said. "Well, everything else around here is about Jesus." And I guess that would be the end of it, but boy, was I wrong. Mrs. Armstrong was still trying to run things from her hospital bed. She called my mother every night and said, "I hate to interrupt your supper," and then went right on interrupting. "But this is the way I have always done it. I select the main parts. I select a Mary, a Joseph, and the wise men, and the angel of the Lord. And then I remind all the rest of the children that every single person is just as important as every other person in the play. The littlest baby angel is just as important as Mary. I tell them that." At which time my mother would say, "Helen, there's somebody at my door. I have to go." But Mrs. Armstrong kept calling my mother, and she was really getting tired of all the instructions. So by Sunday, she wasn't about to listen to anything Mrs. Armstrong had to say. She was going to make it nice and uncomplicated. "We will have our rehearsals on Wednesday at 6:30, she said. "You need to be here every time. And we will now need to choose a Mary, a Joseph, and the wise men. I know many of you would like to be Mary, so I will ask for volunteers. And then we'll decide together which girl should get the part." Everybody expected to see Alice Wendell's hand go up, but before she could move, Emma Jean Herdsman shot her hand up in the air. "Do you have a question, Emma Jean?" my mother asked. "No," said Emma Jean, "I want to be Mary, and Ralph here wants to be Joseph." "Well, we want to give everyone a chance, you know, so we will have to ask for more volunteers." But Alice was now afraid to raise her hand because Emma Jean was a threat to everybody. And Elmer Hopkins was happy that he didn't have to be Joseph anymore, and he could have cheered. But my mother kept trying. "Anyone else want to volunteer? Alice? Janet? Roberta?" Nobody volunteered to be a wise man either, except Leroy, Claude, and Ollie Herdman. Now there was one Herdman left over, and you didn't have to be very smart to figure out that Gladys was going to volunteer to be the angel of the Lord. "What do I have to do?" Alice shouted. "You have to go out into the field and tell the shepherds that Jesus was born." Right away, all the shepherds from the years past began to squirm. Any good news from Gladys would certainly be accompanied by a smack in the teeth. Charlie Carmichael raised his hand and said, "I can't be a shepherd this year. We're going to Philadelphia." Another kid said, "My mother said I couldn't be a shepherd this year," and still another was honest enough to say, "I don't want to be a shepherd this year. Gladys Herdman hits too hard." Not another word, my mother said. No shepherd may quit or go to Philadelphia or get sick. You understand? For 2 or 3 days, all anybody could talk about was the Herdmans being Mary and Joseph and all. Mrs. Homer McCartney called my mother to say that she had been thinking about it, and why didn't we just print programs and let the Herdmans hand them out? "We don't have programs," my mother said. Oh, yes, Imogene is going to be Mary. And yes, Ralph is going to be Joseph. And the others are wise men and the angel of the Lord. You must be crazy, Mrs. Hazelback said. It's not fair for that family just to come in here who don't even go to our church and take over the pageant. Mrs. Armstrong said, if only I had been up and around, this would never have happened. This made my mother mad. So mad she couldn't see straight. That woman, she must be surprised the sun comes up every morning. Well, let me tell you, I'm going to make this the best Christmas pageant anybody ever saw. And I'm going to do it with the Herdmans. After all, they raised their hand and volunteered, and nobody else did. The first rehearsal was about as much fun as a 3-hour ride on a school bus. They got there late. Leroy knuckled Charlie. Gladys made a primary girl yell as she went by, but my mother said she was going to ignore everything but blood. So she just said, and here's the Herdman family. We are so glad to see you. That was the biggest lie she ever told out loud in church. What happens first? Hollered Imogene. That really scared me because I was afraid my mother would go all the way back to Genesis to try to explain it to her, and we'd never get through. The thing was, the Herdmans didn't know anything about Christmas. Everything was new to them. The shepherds, the wise men, the star, the stable, the crowded inn. They didn't even know what a Bible was. They never went to church their whole life until your little brother told them that we had refreshments, complained my friend Alice Wendlekin. She was right, of course. They never read anything except amazing comics, but it looks like they would have seen something about Christmas on TV, except the only TV they had was one that Ralph bought at a garage sale, and you couldn't see anything on it unless somebody held a coat hanger up next to the antenna. So nobody knew anything about Christmas. My mother thought she had better read them the Christmas story about Joseph and Mary and his espoused wife being great with child. Aha, yelled Ralph, I bet she was pregnant. Whoa, that stirred things up and all the kids started giggling. That's enough, Ralph, my mother said, and went on with the story. Alice leaned over and said, it's not right to talk about Mary being pregnant. Great with child sounds better. If my mom knew we were using the P word, she wouldn't want me here. And that was the truth. Mrs. Wendlekin didn't want cats to have kittens, and she didn't want birds to lay eggs, and she wouldn't let Alice visit anybody that had 2 rabbits. By then, my mother got to the part about no room in the inn, and Imogene stood up, stamped her foot, and said, damn, no room, not even for Jesus? This was the first time I'd ever heard a kid swear in church. Well, now, my mother explained, nobody knew it was Jesus yet. Well, you said Mary knew, Imogene explained, and Joseph knew. What's the matter with him that he didn't tell them that she was pregnant and all? What did you say they put the baby in? Asked Leroy. A manager? A manger, my mother said. What kind of a bed is a manger? That's the point, my mother replied. They didn't have a bed, so they had to use the animal's feeding trough. What would you do if you had a new baby and no bed to put it in? We put Gladys in the dresser drawer, Imogene volunteered. Ollie was in the bed and he wouldn't get out. What are waddled up clothes? Asked Claude. Swaddling clothes, my mother answered. Mothers wrapped their babies up tight so they couldn't move around. You mean they tied him up and put him in a feeding box? Where were the child welfare people? Imogene screamed. If they had found Gladys tied up in the dresser drawer, they would have done something about it. And lo, the angel of the Lord came upon them, and the glory of the Lord shone round about them. Gladys said, "Shazam!" She flung her arms out, striking the child next to her. Shazam! The angel of the Lord came right out of nowhere in the middle of the night. Holy cow! This part was getting interesting to Gladys. Now my mother continued, when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem. Yep, that's you, Leroy said. Wise men from the east. Pay attention, Claude and Ollie. They saw the young child with Mary his mother and fell down and worshipped him and presented him gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. What's that stuff? Leroy asked. Well, it's oils and resins, my mother said. What kind of cheap king hangs out oil for a present? The fireman's party gives better presents than that. Then we got to King Herod, and the herdsman never heard of him either. Herod was the one who sent the wise men to find out where the baby was because he planned to have the baby killed. That does it, cried Imogene. He just got born and they're already out to kill him. Who's going to play Herod in this play? You could tell she was eager to get to the scene where she could pounce on Herod and beat him up good. They wanted to know what happened to Herod, but my mother didn't know. None of us knew. All we knew is that he was Herod the king. The next day, the Herdmans went to the library, all 6 of them, and told Mrs. Grabner they wanted library cards. Usually, Mrs. Grabner would say, "How nice. We want all of our boys and girls to have library cards." But she just looked at the herdsman and said, "Why?" And Imogene replied, "We want to read about Jesus." At the next rehearsal, the Herdmans wanted to rewrite the script. They found out that Herod didn't just want to kill Jesus, he had already killed his own wife, and nothing happened to him, and they were so mad about it, I thought they might even quit the pageant, but they didn't. All the while, Alice Wendelkin kept a pad of paper and wrote things down on it. Gladys Herdman drinks communion wine. I see her mouth is all purple. All of them steal crayons from the Sunday school cupboard, and they shake pennies out of the birthday bank. And Imogene smokes cigars in the girls' bathroom, even with her merry costume on. I guess it made her feel good to keep track of all of their bad behavior. But they just didn't know the way things were supposed to be. Imogene didn't know that Mary was supposed to be pure and dreamy and kind to everyone. She thought Mary should be bossy. "You get away from that baby," she yelled at Ralph. "And you wise men, keep your distance. Don't you dare tell Herod where this baby is or I'll make you sorry." Of course, Alice wrote that down and then whispered to me, "Tell your mother I'll be glad to step in and be Mary if Imogene doesn't work out. If I am Mary, Mrs. Perkins will lend me her real baby to use as Jesus, but she wouldn't let Imogene touch him." My mother had called everybody she knew trying to get a baby. Bernice at the foster home offered a darling little Chinese boy she hoped would be okay to be Jesus, but he got adopted 2 weeks before Christmas and he was no longer available. Imogene offered to bring a baby. She said there's always a baby or 2 outside the A&P. "Oh, Imogene, don't be ridiculous. You can't just walk off with somebody's baby." And at that point, my mother decided we would use a doll. The last rehearsal before the pageant, we will go through the whole play without stopping, my mother said. "Okay, remember? Nobody," and Gladys raised her hand and shook her fist. "Just remember, everybody, nobody touches this baby." Imogene, mother said, "Nobody in this pageant is going to have any lines to speak except the angel of the Lord." We looked at the characters. We look at them. This is supposed to make us think about the way it really was at the birth of Jesus. They don't have to say anything. But to tell the truth, the Herdmans did not look like anybody we ever thought about being in the Bible. They were dirty. They were smelly, smelled like mixtures of kerosene and cigar smoke. They had stringy hair, and their faces were streaked with dirt. Their arms and legs were bruised, not at all like the pictures in their Sunday school books. We didn't run through the play without stopping either. All the baby angels had to go to the bathroom. And during the break, Imogene went to the girls' bathroom and lit a cigar. After she left, one of the ladies' aid members came in and smelled the smoke and called the fire department. Mrs. McCarthy was sure the herdsman had set a fire. While the men were checking out the building, the applesauce cakes the ladies were baking got burned up in the kitchen. Reverend Hopkins showed up in his bathrobe, looking very unhappy. The whole of this church is in an uproar, he said to my mother. Don't you think we better call off this pageant? Certainly not, my mother said. This is going to be the greatest Christmas pageant we ever had. I had to admire her. It was kind of like hearing Daniel say, bring on the lions. Reverend Hopkins thought no one would come, but boy, was he wrong. Everybody came. Everybody came to see what the Herdmans was going to do. Mother didn't know what would happen. She said this may be the first pageant where Joseph and the wise men get in a fight and Mary runs away with a baby. But everything settled down and the pageant began right at 7:30. We sang Away in a Manger and O Little Town of Bethlehem. And Mary and Joseph were supposed to come in, but they didn't. So we hummed, and finally they came in, but not pushing and shoving like at practice, but with the spotlight in their eyes, they looked like refugees from the 6 o'clock news. They looked dirty and tired and scared. And suddenly it occurred to me that this is just the way it must have been for the real Holy Family. Stuck away in a barn by people who didn't care anything about what happened to them. The first thing that Imogene did was to pick up that baby and put it on her shoulder and pat him on the back. Alice whispered with a laugh, she thinks Jesus has colic. Actually, I think that was the point. He could have had colic, or been fussy, or hungry, just like any other baby. After all, Jesus didn't come down on a cloud like something out of Amazing Comics. He was a real person. Next came Gladys, the angel of the Lord, with only one thing to say, and she made it the most she could. Hey, she said with her arms raised. She hollered as if it were the best news that the world had ever heard. And all the shepherds trembled because they were sore afraid of Gladys. And it looked very realistic while the angel choir sang. Then came Leroy and Claude and Ollie, the wise men. They were carrying something really heavy. It was not a jar of frankincense or gold or myrrh or anything they were supposed to have. It was a very large ham. I bet they stole that ham, Alice said. But I saw the tag. It was from the Charitable Works Committee that had given out baskets to poor families at Christmas. And it was the one from their basket. Leroy dropped the ham by the manger, and then they all sat down. They were supposed to leave by another way, like the story said, but it made sense to him to sit down and rest up after their long journey. In fact, it all started making good sense before it was over, burping the baby, bringing in food for the mother and father. When we got to the last song, which was Silent Night, we sang all the verses. Everybody in the congregation joined in, and when we sang Silent Night, Holy Night, Son of God, Love's Pure Light, I happened to look over at Imogene and almost dropped my hymn book on a baby angel. Imogene Herdman was crying awful old Imogene, in her crooked veil and with a huge bruise on her face, was crying her eyes out. Well, that was the best Christmas pageant we ever had. Everybody said so, but nobody seemed to know why. There was something very special about it this year. We couldn't put our finger on what it was. When Imogene asked me a few weeks before what the pageant was about, I told her it was about Jesus. But it was also about a poor young mother and a father with a new baby, and no money, and no place to go, and no doctor, and nobody they knew, and they were in a lot of trouble. And the one person who understood that situation best of all was Imogene. In fact, when it dawned on her what Christmas was all about, she just had to cry, and she walked right into the filing cabinet and got a black eye. But she really caught on. She caught on to the reason why we need Jesus. And when we came out of the church that night, it was cold and clear with crunchy snow underfoot and a bright star overhead. And I thought about the angel of the Lord Gladys with her dirty sneakers sticking out from under her robe, lifting her arms and yelling to every one of us everywhere, "Hey, unto you a child is born."
It never gets any better, does it? It gets better every year. Thank you, Sissy, for such a great lesson, especially in the season. The Christmas party, those who have planning to come, we welcome everyone. Please get a hold of Joan because it is Thursday at San Jose. We have a member of our class who is joining the church today.
Jasmine too.
Oh, the whole family is
And
joining.
Ann. And Ann.
Good. Very good. We'll be there to cheer you on.
Oh, yeah.
And we're joining because you all made us your family.
Good. Well, good. Well, we love all of our members.
Boy, we put her to work.
Both of them. We are so happy. Janice called last night and said Patrick was having some problems and with his blood pressure and one thing and another, and so that's why they're not here. So she said they may be in church, but he couldn't come up the stairs. So
Patrick
if you
is
see
at
her,
home.
wish him well because he's having a little rough patch.
Patrick's at home, right?
Yeah.
I got a call from Jean Dark's daughter, Debbie, late yesterday afternoon, and Jean is going to be moving to Taylor. And she's worried to death that she's not gonna have transportation to get to the things she cherishes so here at the church. And so we wanna support her in this move. She's not going with a great deal of happiness and pleasure and cooperativeness.
I want to
But-
go tell her how much she'll love it after a while.
Well, we are kind of saying this is her new ministry, because she's going to be a wonderful Christian leader in Taylor Home.
She'll know everybody's first name and we.
That's right. And so, but she is very concerned that she's not gonna be able to have transportation to get here. So a bunch of us are gonna need to jump in, and she's given so much to all of us that we want to give back to her.
Are there any other concerns of the class? Any announcements?
Suzanne is
Suzanne.
getting some rest. She's a little bit better, not in as much pain. Hoping to go home Monday. Pathology should be back Monday too.
Very good. Keep her in your prayers. You have an announcement?
Jeanette?
I don't want to interrupt y'all's prayer time. Y'all let me
No,
pray.
go ahead, do it.
This year, the staff decided to do an Advent devotional that's sent out by email. So starting the 1st, I've been sending out emails to the people who have signed up. But I know not everybody likes email. So I have a few printed. Now this, because of the way it is, this is only the first week. So this only gets you through next Saturday. So you got to come to church next Sunday to get this. So anyway, I printed out a few, but I thought y'all might like them.
Nice job. Thank you.
So I'm gonna leave a few here. If there's any extra, just drop them off at the office or share them with somebody else that you know. And if we run out, let me know and I'll print more. Okay? And I'll see y'all. I'll have them up here at the beginning of class next week.
Very good.
We also have UNW dinner Tuesday night,
Yeah.
5:30. We would love, Susie would love to have your reservation if you haven't made one.
Many of us have, and look forward to it.
And we are welcoming anybody who will come to come.
Men
Gentlemen are especially welcome.
and Sissy's gonna tell a story. Not the same one she told us. But another good one.
Any other announcements or concerns? If not, St. Thomas, come join us and amuse us, as you always do. Come on up.
Glad to be noticed and I've been promoted. Okay. A German shepherd starts chasing rabbits and before long discovers that he's lost. Wandering about, he notices a panther heading rapidly in his direction with the intention of having lunch. The old German shepherd thinks, oh, I'm in deep trouble now. Noticing some bones on the ground close by, he immediately settles down to chew on the bones with his back to the approaching cat. Just as the panther is about to leap, the old German shepherd exclaims loudly, "Boy, that was one delicious panther. I wonder if there are any more around here." Hearing this, the young panther halts in his attack in mid-strike. A look of terror comes over him and he slinks away to the trees. "Whew," says the panther, "that was close. That old German shepherd nearly had me." Meanwhile, a squirrel who had been watching the whole scene from a nearby tree figures he can put his knowledge to good use and trade it for protection from the panther, so off he goes. The squirrel soon catches up with the panther, spills the beans, and strikes a deal for himself with the panther. The young panther is furious at being made a fool and says, "Here, squirrel, hop on my back and see what's going to happen," to that convincing canine. Now the old German shepherd sees the panther coming with the squirrel on his back and thinks, "What am I going to do now?" But instead of running, the dog sits down with his back to his attackers, pretending he hasn't seen them yet. And just when they get close enough to hear, the old German shepherd says, "Where's that squirrel? I sent him off an hour ago to bring me another panther." The moral of this story is don't mess with the old dogs. Age and skill will always overcome youth and treachery.